Okay. Rapidly emerging virus that jumps species before we have the chance to contain it. A engineered bioweapon that targets specific populations. A zombie apocalypse and we're all doomed. Sounds like science fiction, but is it really? I'm Melissa Berquist with National Resilience, and I've spent my entire career in the biodefense space, so it really thrills me to have the opportunity to sit up here with these gentlemen and talk about public health, which is one of my favorite topics. COVID-19 emerged in a context where we should have been prepared. We had learned lessons from H1N1, and there had been a call for more public-private partnerships, construction of advanced development and manufacturing facilities, increased surveillance systems for early warning, and more robust pipelines for vaccine, therapeutic, and diagnostic products and platforms. With SARS-CoV-2, we had a rapidly moving and quickly evolving threat that led to one of the greatest achievements in modern medicine. Viral sequence to emergency use authorized vaccines in less than 12 months. Doing so required investors to pour money into new companies and technologies. Doing so required biopharmaceutical giants to establish innovation hubs to accelerate promising science. Doing so required the federal government to say, we're here to help, and actually mean it. You will hear from Dr. Disbrow how our federal government has repeatedly answered the call to respond to public health emergencies, but they can't do it alone, which is where our other distinguished panelists, Dr. Jacob Glanville from Centevax and Dr. Daniel Dresner from Tufts University, come in. The bios for all of our panelists are on the website, so I won't read them to you, but it's a distinguished group, and I'm honored to lead us through a deeper look at how we prepare for our next global health crisis. Dr. Disbrow, let's start with you. The Biomedical and Advanced Research and Development Authority, or BARDA, is one agency in the public health response ecosystem. Can you share a little bit of context about how your organization's history in pandemic preparedness and response, and then also maybe speak a little bit to how often outbreaks or epidemics are turning into pandemics and whether that's becoming increasingly common?
Thanks, Melissa, and I also want to thank our partners at ATI for hosting the event today. So the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, our typical focus is on chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats and pandemic influenza. We also have a mandate for emerging infectious diseases, but we don't receive annual appropriations for that. Most of that comes from supplemental funding once an event happens, so we're always in response mode. It's hard for us to prepare for that. But we do support pandemic preparedness since we have annual appropriations for that. H1N1 was the first response that BARDA participated in, and then we participated in every either pandemic or epidemic that has occurred since then, multiple Ebola outbreaks, Zika, being prepared for different strains of influenza virus that are emerging in China or other countries, as well as the COVID-19 response. But again, all of those came from supplemental funding, so we're always in a response mode. What we need to be is better prepared, as you were mentioning. So for COVID-19, BARDA was very involved with our partners with Department of Defense, Joint Program Executive Office, or JPEO, in awarding the very large contracts for vaccine development as well as therapeutic development. But what we need to do moving forward is, again, be better prepared. So under the American Pandemic Preparedness Plan, HHS and DoD, in fact, most parts of the federal government, put forward this plan to prepare for pathogens with pandemic potential, where you could develop prototype vaccines, antiviral drugs, as well as therapeutics. That has not yet been funded, but we collectively as a global community need to work together. There are funders across the globe that do receive funding for emerging infectious diseases, even within HHS, and so we need to collectively work together so that we're better prepared.
Thanks, that makes a ton of sense. And so, Dr. Glanville, I'm going to turn to you to kind of pull on that funding aspect just a little bit more. You're a visionary in the biotechnology space, there's no doubt about it. You have turned scientific innovation into sustainable business models just with incredible aptitude. Could you describe a little bit about the importance of these public-private partnerships and encouraging industry to engage in historically difficult to commercialize space of medical countermeasures?
Yeah, so I mean, as you just said, first off, hello, South by Southwest. The problem so far is that our responses are reactionary. And look, we were faster and better at this pandemic than we ever have been in the history of humanity. But that said, we could be much further along. The challenges that we encounter is that first it's detection, to be able to go pick up a new pathogen, and then it's who pays for creation of a medicine before you need it. And that's where the public-private partnerships come in, or where new business models come in. So in the case of monkeypox, we got lucky. We had a vaccine that already existed that worked reasonably well, and so we're able to mediate the problem before it got bad. But in the case of flu or the coronavirus and these other pandemic potential disease areas, who's going to go commercially build a vaccine for a disease that you don't have a market for yet? And that's where government support on advancing new technologies. So we work on universal vaccine technology. The concept here is that every one of these viruses, flu, coronavirus, Ebola, they always have this little Achilles heel, a couple sites that they can't mutate. And so we focus the immune system on those sites, which means that we can create a flu vaccine that works against all strains of flu. So we can be in that monkeypox style situation. And those technologies are breakthrough because you can mitigate, you can have a population protected before the pandemic even hits and it fizzles out in advance, or you can respond quickly. But to build such technologies requires government funding to go enable the innovation over existing medicine, because there's a certain amount of inertia of what's commercial. I think the other thing, to speak to your point, is that historically the challenge on models are that people are choosing between building like a seasonal flu shot or a pandemic flu shot. And then how the hell do you go pay for a pandemic flu shot if there's no market until pandemic hits? And this is where universal vaccine technologies are super useful, because you're actually just making a single product that replaces the seasonal vaccine market, so we have an existing market, but it has the additional benefit that it's able to go block pandemics when they hit. And I think that kind of technological alignment with market forces is how we can build aggressively better medicines so that we can stop these new pandemics before we strike, and so that we have tools for future decades to attempt eradication campaigns against pathogens where previously that was not possible.
How do we make that sustainable, though? It seems like we're going through this ebb and flow of like, oh my gosh, we need to do something, and there's a huge influx of money, and industry works to be like, look at all these tools we have.
Yeah, so two parts. One is government funding, and we've been very fortunate to have the BARDA Ventures arm, the Global Health Investment Corporation, has invested in us. We've received the Quickfire Challenge Award through BARDA and J&J through the Project NextGen Award. These things enable us to build these new, better classes of technologies. The other thing we do is we focus on markets that are not sensitive to the ebb and flow. So flu is a $7 billion market, and it's governed by lukewarm vaccines that have somewhere between 10 and 60% efficacy. So I think we can aim at a market that's robust to produce something which is both seasonal and pandemic. But the ignition energy, the overcome the inertial barrier, bringing a new technology online, that's where it's so essential to have these government partnerships. And we've been fortunate also to work with the Naval Medical Research Command, with RARE, with the NIH, and these various tools. I'm not saying it's perfect. I still feel that there are some like non-dilutive funding gaps to be able to enable new medicines to move forward. But these do make it possible, and historically, that is where you have an alignment of the government's desire to make sure the population is stable, the economy is not affected, we're medically protected, and our navies and armies and military is not impacted by an outbreak of a new pandemic, or of someone manipulating a pathogen as a weapon. But I think this is the path where we can go bring these new technologies online and make a safer world.
Makes a ton of sense. So, Dr. Disbrow, you mentioned the relationship between Department of Defense and Health and Human Services. And so this question is for everyone. And just before I get to it, those of you in the audience, we will have time for question and answer at the end. So if you have like burning thoughts, there will be a point where I say, please queue up at the mic. So just keep them in mind, put them in the notes in your phone or whatever. But we will have an opportunity for that at the end. So I'm going to start this question to you, Dr. Dresner, because I'm confident that you have some thoughts on this topic. But that partnership between DoD and Health and Human Services, Operation Warp Speed, it was an incredible scientific, logistic, public relations feat. I mean, we mobilized manufacturing supply chains, public health infrastructure at a speed and scale that's never been done before. So what I would like to hear from you, Dr. Dresner, is what are some things that we learned or could do better or differently that we need to carry forward, as well as some hard lessons in what we need to change about how we think about pandemics?
Thanks for the question, Melissa. thanks to South by Southwest and ATI for the invitation. And I'm going to start with a very important sentence, which is to say I'm not that kind of doctor. I'm a social scientist. I have a PhD in political science, not in medicine. And the reason I say that is because when we think about how we could do better, and if I'm thinking about what we did with COVID, on the one hand, as you say, it was miraculous in terms of what was done in terms of the vaccine. It was done lightning fast. The previous record, I believe, was 4 years from development to vaccine. Where I do think the government failed, unfortunately, or where there was a significant failure, was on two sides. The first was in the initial reactions to dealing with the pandemic, the sort of non-medical interventions that I think is what are commonly talked about, in which, for a variety of reasons, mistakes were made, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Mm-hmm. I think the biggest mistake that was made in terms of talking about the vaccines was the failure to prepare a narrative to tell people about what the expectations should be in terms of when the vaccine will be ready, how it will be processed, and so forth. And so as a result, you can get people to do something in an emergency situation for 3 weeks or for 3 months, but as we learn painfully, after that, all bets are off. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, historically, one of the things to remember about pandemics is that pandemics are often a moment where the state exercises extreme amounts of authority, and this makes people who are suspicious of state authority suspicious of the disease that they are trying to potentially avoid. And that's what led to a lot of distrust that wound up unfortunately festering in terms of things like vaccine uptake and so forth. And as we all know, vaccines are only as effective as the degree to which you can develop herd immunity. And so the more people who are skeptical of it, the less effective it is, and that creates a doom loop in terms of this. So part of the problem is that governments have to be you have to ask governments to do something that they are not good at doing, which is to be ahead enough of the curve to be able to actually tell people, look, this is how we think things are going to go. Could go this way, could go that way. But that is something that governments are often loath to do because, and in many cases, this is the case, they don't trust the public.
Yep. So, Dr. Disbrow, you do not speak on behalf of the entire federal government, right? You represent one small piece of our public health
I accept you from all of this,
infrastructure.
Yes.
So when we talk about government, right, like that's a big thing. And in the context of COVID-19, it stretched multiple departments, agencies within departments, but maybe you can kind of add your thoughts onto Dr. Dresner's.
So I agree with the comments that you've made. I think one of the things that we should have done better is perhaps not as to tout how quickly we were able to do it, because I think that caused a lot of skepticism for people. Even though the people working on the vaccines and the manufacturing, we were doing everything that was necessary. We were making sure that all the regulatory documents were in place, especially for manufacturing, because that was happening in parallel to the clinical trials, which is not what typically occurs. For product development, you go into phase 3. If you have an initial or interim read that perhaps it's effective, you may move into scale-up and validation of commercial scale manufacturing. We were doing that at risk. That is the risk that the government assumed by supporting the manufacturers to do that in parallel. So I think that was an area where we could have improved. Another area where we could have improved is working with trusted partners within the community to amplify the message, as opposed to it coming from a White House podium, again, supportive of previous administration, current administration, but just moving forward, how do you get the message out there so that it doesn't appear to be, just a government message? But yes, there were, multiple departments were involved, multiple agencies were involved. As you mentioned, Daniel, I don't think we need to be afraid to say this is what we're hoping for, but it may not turn out, so that people know that it's not, all, roses and rainbows.
Yeah, and as an industry participant in this, Dr. Glanville, I mean, you're continued to be in this space, right? We're not, COVID-19 is not 100% over. We're still investing in it. We're still advancing new technologies. So maybe what has evolved for you as we've gone through the last couple of years, and what have you learned?
Sure. So First, echoing what you both were talking about, leading up to the pandemic, there was an atrophy of funding for the CDC. And so in retrospect, the CDC should have been that spokesperson. It could have been a little bit independent of the White House. It should have been able to get ahead of things. There's going to be some chaos in a pandemic, but I think that there was some mixed messaging that went flop back and forth, and I think there was I just think we could have used to take advantage of other industries that are really good at public communication and to enhance that and to not atrophy the CDC. I think that would have helped. I completely agree with your point. In terms of what we did well versus what we could do better, we talked about the good things, right? We got a vaccine out in record time. I think it was effective. This was a remarkable success, and it speaks to the power of coordinated data and the work we've done on these related viruses leading up to it. But there was a bunch of things we could have done much, much better. So I'm going to take you on a little journey with me, going up a series of steps of good to great. So as we move forward, there are things we built that were great, like the sewer system. We now have this global sewer system network where we can look for sequences of new pathogens emerging, and that's amazing because otherwise you have to wait for the pathogen outbreak to be big enough so that it swarms a hospital enough so that some doctor goes, wait, what the hell is going on here? And then they start testing, because we barely test for pathogens we know about enough. We certainly don't test for new ones, and that means your outbreak has already gotten further than it would have otherwise. These systems allow us to do global surveillance of the state of outbreak and the emergence of any pathogen of concern. The limitations are that sometimes there's perverse incentives for some nations not to want to reveal that they have a pathogen outbreak because they might shut their borders and cause other problems. So I think enhancing that system and monitoring it and make sure it's open for view will help protect us. The next step is, look, it's great to have a vaccine you can produce in a year, but it's far greater to have a vaccine that already is ready right out of the gate. And so that's part of the work we're doing and work by others to create universal or broad spectrum vaccines that have a broad protection that already hits the cousins of viruses that we already know about. And that has the effect of crushing out a vaccine. You could crush out a pandemic before it even starts if you have enough community exposure, or you can do what we did with the monkeypox outbreak and is administer it very quickly to crush out the embers before it turns into an open flame. As you go beyond that, I think that what I was surprised by is that there's not like a pandemic treaty or something where we deal with the collective goods problem. Like here in the United States, when a given nation has a crisis, there's mechanisms to support them and respond to them. And we had a lapse of that, and so there was this global collective goods problem, which was kind of interesting because we got to learn how different policies played out. But the problem is that we all get sick if not everybody's tamping down on these things effectively together, and I think it would behoove international collective health to have some sort of treaty in place. And then the final thing, I think it is essential that we reinitiate the discussion about eradication campaigns. And I know this isn't easy, but I will remind you, we eradicated smallpox in the 1970s. That was a pathogen that we can see on the face of the fucking pharaoh 4,000 years ago. It harassed humanity for centuries, millennia, and then in the 70s, they wiped it out. And I have to believe we can do better than the 70s. We have these remarkable monitoring tools, we have better technology, and if we don't enable these things in the next series of decades, it will just get worse because there's new viruses, new pathogens entering into the global population, which travels now, and there's more of us, that will have new HIV, and now we have coronavirus, and we'll keep stacking these additional pathogens. So I think that that's not going to be easy because of the global coordination problem, but I think it is essential that we now have these technologies that can enable us to go after these pathogens, and we have to reestablish our efforts. Much like we are now doing with the space programs, which were very advanced in the 60s and 70s and then atrophied, I think we need to re-engage an effort to be able to eliminate some of these pathogens because we've done it before and we have better tools and we can do it again.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, I think in like all of humanity, we've eradicated 2 diseases, one in animal health and one public health threat.
Yeah.
I mean,
so that's easy. That means we're not the first ones to do it.
exactly.
Yeah.
So I totally agree that that needs to be an area of focus, and I think all the things that you mentioned that contribute to that societally and from like a global ecosystem perspective feed into it. Like it's not just technology, it's not just having the right tools or the right foresight to understand what disease is coming next. It is a global problem.
And it's the unique advantage of vaccine technology is that they, unlike most other medical interventions, can alter the frequency of the disease they're designed to treat. And in some cases, they can wipe that out for every generation that happens afterwards until the end of time. And that's the power of the technology. It's just our duty now over the next decades to wield it effectively.
just to build off that, you're absolutely right. So I think Ebola showed us, and we have known that the fastest response is to have an FDA-approved product already on the shelf. And so in 2014 and 2016, the outbreak in West Africa, we had investigational products, vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. Through a lot of hard work by international collaborators as well as the US government, we were able to license a vaccine. We now have 2 licensed therapeutics and a licensed point of care diagnostic, so that now when there's an Ebola outbreak in any country in Africa, those products are immediately available to squash the outbreak. And that is the best thing that we can do. Moving forward for new pathogens, you mentioned influenza. So there's a seasonal influenza market, but there's not a seasonal market for Nipah or Lassa. So what do we do for those? And it's really to develop, starting from the beginning, outside of surveillance, we have to have better surveillance, ideal antigens being developed for different pathogen families or viral families, and then doing those phase 1 and phase 2 clinical studies. But the most important thing, I believe, is to make sure that you scale up manufacturing to the commercial scale so that you can actually, if there is an outbreak, you can actually have millions and millions of doses. And then to your other point about the ebbing and flowing of funding is really to sustain the infrastructure that we've already built. So the US government has invested billions of dollars expanding domestic capacity and onshoring raw components that are necessary for vaccine, sterile injectable manufacturing in general. And everybody thinks that's very focused on the US. It is, however, the US expanding their domestic capacity frees up capacity in other countries so that it is available for others. And we're also building capacity so that it can be shared with the global community. But how do we sustain that moving forward? Because if we're not utilizing it, the companies, the private sector companies, cannot support that on their own. They cannot, the overhead is the biggest cost for manufacturing. And so to have the people on hand ready to manufacture tens of millions of doses at any given time over the course of 10 years is unsustainable for a company. So we have to do better to figure out how to sustain all of these investments so that we don't go backwards, so that we have this available for any outbreak that occurs.
Yeah.
And I think getting back to the question you asked me earlier, the reason we had all those tools for Ebola was because of government. So government has a longer attention span than the quarterly update requirements of small companies. And so it's government realizing, okay, this is not a thing that reliably comes up in the next 2 or 3 quarters, but eventually it's going to be hit and it's going to be bad. And so I think that's a critical area where or the equine encephalitis or these other pathogens that you look to, and we have these anticipatory defenses set up so that it's not catastrophically disruptive to our global economies and medical systems and so forth. And I think that's part of that working relationship. It's kind of like government made the spacecraft to get us up to the moon, and they built a lot of technology, and now after that, commercialization can come in and turn it into a working business, but you guys create the fuel of the technology development to get us to that point.
Yeah, and I think kind of to both of those points, like the strategic national stockpile is not target, right? Like you can't just have everything on the shelf exactly as much as you need to be able to respond when an emergency happens. You have to have that like rapid ability to scale. And for those facilities, they need to be full all the time so that they are ready. They have all their quality systems in place, but then they have to readily be able to transfer to, okay, now we're in a public health emergency and we need to make this the priority.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
It just made me realize, you're sitting next to you, I should ask. So because of the requirement of being able to manufacture at scale when shit hits the fan, excuse my French, but does that bias you, or do you identify certain technologies that are more useful than others because of like rapid scale-up potential?
So we're always looking for the ability to rapidly scale manufacturing, and everybody uses the term platform technology. It is overused, and we were talking about this in the other room. So for Ebola, that is a vectored vaccine, and so we're working with other companies to address other viral hemorrhagic fevers, and we're using that as a platform technology, but it is not the same when you're manufacturing. When you switch out the antigens, there are other issues that appear during the manufacturing process. So that, again, goes back to my point about for each of these pathogens, you need to validate and scale up, because if you don't, you will just always have, clinical trial material. But, the 100-day mission, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, it's a very ambitious goal that was set out by the US government to have sufficient vaccine for every American within 120 days. and for the globe within 200 plus days. I mean, that is a very ambitious goal. And again, this goes back to all the infrastructure that has been developed. You need a global manufacturing network to be able to manufacture at global scale,
Correct.
Population scale manufacturing. But for mRNA, we have shown that you can do that. So the original mRNA vaccine, again, 11 months. When the strain change came, they were able to manufacture tens of millions of doses within 60 days, but it's based on a licensed vaccine. So again, this goes back to, if you have a licensed vaccine, that lets you know that that platform can support a vaccine. It's really not a platform until you license a second vaccine using that same technology.
Part of the,
go ahead.
I would say part of the problem here is the politics of this, which is,
Yeah.
to put it gently, in democracies, you would think that you would be rewarded for investing significantly in preventive technology. And to be fair, I don't want to say that you're not necessarily. There are two problems, though. The first is that you tend to be much more heavily rewarded for crisis response rather than crisis prevention. And so this means that you invest in things like fire engines rather than fire prevention. And this goes to the problem of vaccines. And the second problem is that over the long term, inevitably there are budgetary pressures on governments that say, well, where can we cut? And in this sense, unfortunately, this is the one area where governments are like households. In every other area, it's the worst metaphor in the world. But in this one area, it's true, which is when budgets are tight, people cut insurance payments.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what you're talking about investing in.
No, and to build off that, the Department of Defense does not wait until there's a war to start building ships and tanks. Right. And what BARDA does, and this is a little bit self-centered, I consider it part of national security. So preparing for CBRN events or pandemic influenza or the next pandemic, that is part of national security. It's part of global security. I mean, we saw the impact that this had on the globe. And so I think it is really necessary, as you were saying, to have the funds to prepare for. If you're always chasing the virus, you're always going to be behind.
Yeah. So, Dr. Dresner, just a little bit more about kind of the human element of this, right? Like, how do we account for that very personalized decision-making process in our preparedness and response activities?
So, one of the takeaways that I've wrote a small book a while ago called Theories of International Politics and Zombies, asking the very important question, how would societies react if dead started rising from the grave? And one of the conclusions I came from this fit perfectly what happened both during Ebola and during COVID, which is that essentially there's this paradox of crisis response, which is very often when an immediate crisis hits, that is actually the moment when publics will tend to trust experts the most, all right? Because it's sort of a rally around the flag effect. It's like, okay, there's an immediate crisis, want to hear what authorities have to say, we're going to follow them. That is also often the moment when authorities know the least about what they are coping with, because they're dealing with, by definition, a non-standard moment. Their standard operating procedures can't cope with this. And unfortunately, the problem is that over time, governments and experts get much better at figuring out how to deal with this stuff. And this happened during COVID, not just in terms of the development of the vaccine, but also in terms of dealing with palliative care. The mortality rates for COVID went way down 6 months in, long before the vaccine, because doctors figured out how to treat it. Unfortunately, during that same period of time, that is when publics start distrusting experts, because they can point to instances in which experts said one thing and something else happened. And so that's the kind of paradox that you have to deal with. I think, weirdly, there are situations where governments are fearful of the initial public response, and they shouldn't be. If you actually take a look at things like open table data, it was very clear that people, as COVID was breaking out, were preemptively curtailing their activity before the government actually started saying it was a big problem. They could see with their eyes, and they could hear enough about the news what was going on. And so there's this common tendency, a sort of sociology of panic, the belief that the public will freak out when they are initially exposed to news or an initial shock. The public actually tends to respond pretty well initially. The problem is over time. And so the biggest challenge for governments, the biggest challenge for the private sector as well, is to maintain trust going forward. It's when you acknowledge mistakes and do so honestly and also say, look, this is where we think things are going. And it's hard to do that because, particularly in a polarized political climate where it is very easy and where there are actors with strong political incentives to try to discredit the very experts that are promoting an idea.
So Dr. Disbrow, I'd like to pitch that to you, but then also in the context, we've talked a lot about the technology, the speed, the innovation, and those are areas where BARDA focuses, right? But how do we account for this human piece within that context, but then also within the context of this larger infrastructure, the funding sustainability, all of it that's required for these cogs to turn collectively when we think about delivering these technologies in a future public health emergency? Because it's not just the tools that Jake and his team are developing, it's a much larger picture.
No, agree. And just so everybody's aware, I'm not a political appointee. I'm a federal employee, so I've worked across.
I'm sorry that I'm not trying to imply this is just you. I feel bad about that. It's definitely not you.
No, I've worked across multiple administrations, and thankfully my job is to make sure that we have vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics available to anybody who wants them.
Right.
But again, the government, all your points are valid, and then on top of that, administrations change potentially every 4 to 8 months. Yeah. And then you have new leadership coming in for many of the departments that are part of that response. So that complicates the issue as you're moving forward. But I do think it really is important that we take some of the positives, and by that I mean innovations that came out of the pandemic, and move those forward. So we support, as Jacob was mentioning, Global Health Security Investment Corporation, which is BARDA's ability to have a partnership with a venture capital firm. We also have our Blue Knight program, our CARB-X program for AMR. Those are all innovative ways that we invest in small companies that have innovative technologies and push those to the forefront. Wastewater surveillance system, pushing wearable devices to individuals so that they know that they may be infected with something before, as you were saying, everybody shows up at the hospitals and the doctors are overwhelmed. The healthcare system and, digital health. I mean, my parents are over 80 years old, barely work on a computer. I never thought I would see them, talking to their doctor on a Zoom call. Yeah. And so it's not perfect. We still have a long way to go to make sure that everybody in the US can access their doctor as easily as, some people are, but that digital health and just home health care system is a positive that came out of the pandemic, and I think can improve public health as we move forward. But it's, again, pushing those innovative ideas so that we have the ability to respond much more efficiently.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I'm glad to hear that your parents are taking advantage of telehealth. It's so convenient. But I think that does kind of shift the question a little bit, right? We've spent a lot of time talking about response, but prevention, the very far upstream side of this, I mean, how do we get better at prevention? Pandemics, epidemics, outbreaks, all of it, from a public health perspective, shouldn't that really be where we need to focus? I'm just going to offer that to the panel.
I'm going to say a prefatory and then turn to the actual experts on this, which is it's worth remembering that part of the reason we're in a situation now where this is a concern is precisely because of the massive success we've had over the last 150 years in terms of the development of vaccines for a whole variety of systems. Because without that, you don't have the degree of urbanization that we have right now and that's continuing. You also don't have the degree of globalization in terms of travel that we have now. The problem is that those two things are the things that create, unfortunately, a global petri dish. That if there is another, pathogen that comes out, it's going to spread more quickly. And so that's the paradox of any kind of, of vaccine success. If you do it, absolutely, it should be celebrated, it should be trumpeted, the whole point of disease eradication, things like this. But it does make it easier for the next one to potentially happen. So the problem is it's not either or in terms of prevention or preparedness, it's both.
So, yeah, echoing that, I think we take for granted the healthy period that we live in now. Because I had hippie parents, I ended up growing up in a small Mayan village. on Lake Atitlán in Guatemala, and so I got to see sort of the demographic transition and the health transition that happened pretty quickly when the war ended in 1996. And we live in a period where I think we quickly forget as humans. We don't have the long attention span for how far we've come, and the fact that we still are in the middle of the vaccine golden age in this radical medical transition, but it's not done yet. You spoke to prevention. I think there are these technologies and there's better medicines. There's preparing things in advance, but vaccines are powerful preventative tools because they avoid the disease, $20, $30 a shot as opposed to thousands of dollars of treatment. And they have this knock-on effect that we talked about with herd immunity, where you have enough people taking it and it reduces the incidence of the disease in the first place. It's absolutely also true that we have a very populated world and people travel a lot. It was crazy during the pandemic watching the new strains and how quickly they would pop up in all these different countries, because we had these tools and a new mutation basically was a barcode, so we could see how quickly this stuff was spreading. And the good news is that our technologies are evolving faster than our pathogens now. And so we are in the middle of a golden age in biotechnology, and we can apply those technologies to further advance and further prepare ourselves. There's a lot of pathogens, but they come from a finite number of cousins. And so it's very unlikely now that a new pathogen is going to pop up and we've never seen a version of it before. And that means, like with the pandemic, we'll benefit from 10 years of research on a related cousin, which will enhance our ability to respond. So I'm reasonably optimistic about the future. That my concerns are really about political will and organization, not so much about technology anymore. Before I stop, I just want to say, I think when I listed the folks that have supported us, I forgot to mention ATI. So I want to say thank you, ATI, and MTech and these programs as well. So I just, apologies for not mentioning you earlier.
Just one point. I think we need to do better on global surveillance. You mentioned it earlier. A lot has been learned from COVID-19, the COVID pandemic, and I do believe that there's more of an awareness of that now. Mm-hmm. But I do think, as you mentioned, Jacob, some countries are concerned about reporting, even though there's the IHR, International Health Reporting, where countries are supposed to report to WHO when there's something occurring. The potential fear that their borders may be closed, or something may happen as far as like funding or just ostracized. But we need to have this global sharing of that information, mm-hmm. so that everybody knows what's happening and what's going on, so that we can respond as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And it's a trust thing, right? Like, we are a global community, but I think the reciprocity of that trust has to also be we really will be there to help. I mean, I think there was this...
but this is also where the cooperation on COVID was an unmitigated disaster.
I was just
sorry.
There was a perception of developed countries buying up huge quantities of vaccine, right, much more than they could use for themselves, and then cherry picking where it went, stockpiling it for future use. I mean, there's got to be trust on both sides.
Right. I mean, you talk about there being a treaty for a pandemic. There was a treaty, the International Health Regulations for the WHO, and it was thought that particularly after SARS, we had worked out the kinks for this, that there was, even China ostensibly had recognized the rewards for more transparency, and COVID just blew all of that up. And that's in some ways, if I was to think of like where could you do the greatest good with the fewest amount of dollars, that would actually be that. If you could repair the WHO's reputation and actually get some degree of after action thinking about how can we do this better, it would be in that area.
And I guess I'm a hammer and everything looks like a nail, but in terms of the technology thing where you'd have to spend some dollars and it would help, there was a manufacturing issue globally when the medicines became available, and so the developing world was last in line in terms of getting access, and there was a long time to get it. The mRNA technologies, that's another major advance that happened. We de-risked a new class of very scalable vaccine delivery systems, and the advantage of these platforms is that you can produce a much smaller, they're called GMP manufacturing sites, they're the place where you manufacture vaccines, and the footprint for those sites is much smaller and cheaper. It's still expensive. These are special rooms with people with suits on them that have to gown in and out. But they're crazy cheaper compared to manufacturing antibodies, as an example. And so there's an effort to try to have GMP facilities built in a lot more nations rather than relying on a limited number of nations and their capacity. That won't solve everything. We had like crazy shortages of like plastic supplies and stuff during the pandemic, but being able to treat it like the internet and globally distribute manufacturing responsibility I know LATAM is focusing on this, certainly Africa, Australia. Everybody wants to be able to have that unilateral capacity to protect their own nation and their neighbors without having to wait for the first world to decide we've had enough and give them our scraps. And so I think that's something that needs to be built over the next 10 years. And these technologies make that more tractable because they're much less expensive to establish these systems.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think it's the facilities themselves, but it's also the technical knowledge and the workforce and all that goes along with it. But if you can have those facilities to enable distributed manufacturing, then not only are you better prepared to be able to hopefully, get ahead of a pandemic, but then they can also respond to, local outbreaks right in their own community.
You're absolutely right. The experts is what's going to be rate limiting with this, because there's a special type of training that's involved in building these facilities. And if you built 30 of them in 30 nations, you wouldn't have enough experts to go distribute around them to go do the training. So that is a built-in part of this. It's a boutique solution that typically hasn't been distributed globally, but I think it's essential long-term that we do so.
Yeah. Thankfully, BARDA invests in workforce development.
Yeah, so we actually did, through one of our Centers for Innovation, Advanced Development, and Manufacturing, we brought individuals over from different countries within Africa and actually trained them on vaccine manufacturing, and we modified that. Specifically, there was an mRNA component, but back to your point, whatever is established in Africa or in any country needs to be sustainable. It needs to be more than response to a future pandemic or response to localized outbreaks. These manufacturers need to consistently be manufacturing licensed vaccine, malaria vaccine, yellow fever vaccine, and AFRICOM needs to work together. You can't support a manufacturing facility in each country, but perhaps regionally, and then the countries surrounding that manufacturing facility have to agree to purchase their annual vaccines that they're using to vaccinate individuals from that facility so that it can be sustained. If it's not, we're not going to be able to sustain those.
The good news is it gets back to the unique business models, and that is that such facilities, as long as they're producing high quality product, they absolutely could be self-sustaining, because there's a CRO market, a contract research organization market, to go manufacture new vaccines. And I'll tell you, in my space, there's often a waiting list, and it's time sensitive. It's like there's not enough hotels and too many people coming to South by Southwest. Yeah. That's what it's like to make new medicines. And so having more of these facilities, they'll fill up. There would be, in fact, if they filled up and the prices went down a little bit, which they should in developing countries, then that actually opens up more investigator-led trials and ultimately more medicines.
Yep, totally agree. So this is going to be my last question for the panel, and I'm going to direct it to all three of you. So this is your opportunity. If you've been saving up your little nuggets, you can line up at the mic to be able to ask some of the panelists once we're done with this one last question. So in your opinion, each of you have unique, domains of expertise, right? What are the worst and best case scenarios for future pandemics? Zombie apocalypse?
Well, okay, you should go last.
I should definitely go last on this one. So,
This is going to be amazing.
So I can start. Worst case is that we don't learn anything from the current pandemic. We don't sustain at least some of the infrastructure that we have developed, that we don't sustain some of the collaborations that we have developed both within the federal government and in the global community, and slip backwards, so that 5 years from now, we're no better off than we were in December of 2019. Best case scenario is that we really can work together, not only the US government, but with our global partners, to make sure that there's manufacturing capacity that is global manufacturing capacity, just not in the high income countries that LMI sees. Low middle income countries also have the capability to manufacture vaccines and therapeutics and diagnostics, because it's more than just the vaccine. You have to be able to diagnose and know those people that need to be treated before the vaccine may be ready. And to have a library of prototype vaccines and antivirals and therapeutics, potentially not for all viruses, but as you mentioned, there are a limited number of viral families with pandemic potential. At least have a portfolio of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics for each of those, so that we can be faster in the future as we respond.
Look, I'd agree with that. I think what I worry about is it could be worse than this current one. We have greater vaccine hesitancy, and so if there's not an effort to get people comfortable. Maybe they'll stop saying the technologies are new because we've used them for longer. But I think also if it's not addressed, you could build up a greater population of vaccine hesitancy or just like distrust of authorities. And I'd actually like to get your opinion on how do you fix that. So that we'd hit another, and then the other one obviously is that this pandemic hit with it was complicated because it was right at this threshold of significantly worse than flu, but not as bad as Ebola or a zombie apocalypse. And I think that actually creates a more complicated set of policy decisions. It gets easier if it was much worse. But that's always the risk also, that something comes out much worse. 1918, we had Spanish flu that killed at least 50 million people, and there weren't that many people back then either, right? So you could definitely we had plagues that were catastrophic a few centuries ago. And so I think that's worse, is that we're the population is less willing to respond, and we don't depoliticize some of these decisions. And the flip side, how it could be better, the best case scenario, look, I'm a technologist and an optimist, so I'm gonna look pretty hard to what the best case scenario would be. The best case scenario is that we do have this way better surveillance system to detect pathogens very early. We have universal vaccines that can provide preventative protection against new strains or new variants when they pop up, and that we're successful on engaging some eradication campaigns. This is going to take time, but in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, that we are able to wipe off the face of the earth forever some pathogens. So we never have to worry about that pathogen ever again. That's the best case scenario. It's not impractical. We have done it before. And I think it is essential that we do it again. Otherwise, this problem just gets more and more annoying as we move forward. And we have the technologies to accomplish it. I think that's a very positive, that's the best case scenario, is that we work with a world that has less infectious disease forever because we've destroyed many of them. Now I'll pass over to a very interesting worst case scenario.
So I have to start by saying, to double down on your point, it was called the Spanish flu, not because it originated in Spain. It was because Spain was one of the few countries that could report on it, because it was during the First World War, so they were actually honest in terms of the reporting, and that's how it got that name, which is unfortunate. I think the best case scenarios have already been laid out. The way I would put it is that, never count out a species that invented duct tape and smartphones. And so, our ability to be innovative enough to deal and to be smarter than pathogens is considerable. And if we can rack up, in some ways, concrete wins, like the eradication of smallpox is one of those great things that you can point to say, see, this is what this technology can produce. The fact that we had the vaccine in less than 11 months, that is also something that is tangible, although, as you pointed out, in some ways, it was oversold, which led people to think that it was risky because when it in fact was not. But the more that you can generate those kinds of concrete wins, that's not just good for society, it's also a good political accomplishment, so that's not nothing. The worst case, the worst case is that a pathogen emerges that has two properties. The first would be one that when you get sick causes significant long-term complications rather than just short-term complications, in which case you're talking about a long-term public health crisis that would be difficult to avert. And second, that it emerges in a concentrated ethnic population. And so as a result, the one thing we haven't talked about so far is that one of the hardy perennials of pandemics is that inevitably foreigners and minority groups are blamed as being the source of them. We saw that happen a little bit with respect to COVID in terms of anti-Asian discrimination. But if you go back historically, it's been a constant there. And so if it emerges in a particular place that is somehow seen as we must guard against this population rather than the disease, that is, that's worse than the zombie apocalypse.
Yeah. And to pull on that for just a second, there are other panels throughout South by Southwest talking about health equity and inequity, so I encourage you to go seek those out, because not only is the potential targeting of a population an issue, but I think we need to acknowledge that health inequity in this country, not only this country, is a challenge and was a challenge during the COVID-19 response, and it's something that we also need to do better at. So please seek those panels out. I'm going to pause. I think we've got at least one question. So we'll start with you. If you could please just say your name and where you're from, and if you're press, please acknowledge it.
I'm Bruce Spector. I live in Austin.
Super.
I've actually been in the healthcare industry too. Thank you for a terrific presentation. To be in the audience where all the participants are contributing at a high level is a real joy. Thanks. I'd like to follow up on your last question about looking into the future and to personalize it a little bit. During the COVID pandemic, families that could in urban areas left those urban areas to go into rural areas to isolate themselves because they didn't know what the risks were and they thought that was safe. And I'd like each of you to personalize it for yourselves. If you had the funds, your family had the funds to be able to buy a safe house now, proactively, would you do it? And if so, what are the characteristics you look for in your safe house?
It's a great question. I think Dr. Dresner has the answer to this one. And I only know that because we talked about it in the green room, so I'm going to put him on the spot.
I have two answers to this. The first is if you'd like to buy my house right now. No, I'm just kidding. I got asked this a lot during when I was talking about the zombie book, and the answer I give is not in this country. It would be New Zealand, which, by the way, is where apparently a lot of the tech billionaires are buying property. This is for multiple reasons. First, because it's geographically isolated, New Zealand was one of the few countries that was able to sort of pursue we're going to stop this at the border response, which normally never works. But because they're sufficiently isolated, it did work extremely well there. Second, everything grows in New Zealand, so there's plenty of food and so on and so forth. And third, the wines are excellent. So as a place to go, it's not a bad option. Yeah, zombies can't climb. Also, that's a whole separate conversation.
No, we're going to beat the pathogens. I'm not moving.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe for my mom and my dad and my immediate family so that they can stay safe, but I want to be part of the solution, and try and do whatever we can. Because if everybody did that, there would be nobody around to support development of the vaccines and support the response.
Yeah, love it. Next question.
Thank you. I'm Julie Gerberding at the Foundation for the NIH, former CDC director and former president of Merck Vaccines. So this has been a really fascinating.
So you know nothing.
No, but I really appreciate the level of discussion and the thinking that's going on. I'm probably not as enthusiastic about the prospects of eradicating all infectious diseases, but I do wonder if we're putting too much emphasis on vaccines and perhaps need to also be thinking about antivirals and small molecule solutions, in part because localization of manufacturing for small molecules is a whole lot easier than localizing manufacturing of vaccines. I just feel like right now we're probably underestimating the importance of that in our countermeasure development. So I'd love to hear your perspectives on that.
Sure, so I guess I'll start. First off, I agree with you, and it was fortunate that we had treatments as well as vaccines. In fact, you need both, because you need measures to be able to stop the population from getting sick, but you also need to be able to treat. You can't give a vaccine to someone who's already sick. It's too late. It takes time for it to take effect. So you need, and particularly with diseases that had significant adverse outcomes from being sick, you need to be able to treat them. And fortunately, we are building larger and larger reference sets of small molecules that we can test, and we were able to move relatively quickly to make, there was, the path through, there's some things that didn't work that well, and then they eventually got to the good stuff that worked quite well, and I think we have a couple powerful antivirals now. I think that would get back to your point of being able to have antivirals ready. Maybe you need to perform some R group extension exploration to customize to a new virus, but to the extent that we have preemptively created backbones for new antivirals, that's important to be able to have. Now, with respect to the vaccines, all pathogens is a long walk. I wasn't saying that. Some of them are going to be very difficult to be able to eradicate, but I think some of them are within reach, and we should attempt to do so. So I want to nuance and agree with you on that point. With respect to manufacture, it's small molecules, so in principle you could manufacture them, but it gets, as you well know, it gets down to the devil of the details of the organic chemistry, where some of them are reasonable and some of them are going to be more challenging when there's, I remember there was details with supply chain issues during the manufacture of some of these molecules during the pandemic, and so I think that would need to be sorted out as well.
Just two quick responses. First, I take your point about eradication, because smallpox was easy. It wasn't zoonotic. You didn't have to worry about a population elsewhere. So it is pointing out that was, as hard as that was still low-hanging fruit. The second thing is on the supply chain stuff, and this isn't related so much to the vaccines, but more generally, I do think one of the big misnomers that people took away from COVID was the belief of, we have to localize our supply chains, that this demonstrated how vulnerable we were if everything shut down globally. And as the economic analysis is coming in, that is a wildly inaccurate perception. In fact, it was actually the economies that were the most globalized, that were best able to respond quickly to the pandemic. And part of the reason for this is that if you try to localize everything, yeah, in theory that could work, but as all of you living in Texas are aware, if let's say you rely on your energy only from one place and something goes wrong locally, then you are in much deeper trouble than if you were trying to rely on things globally. So correcting that misperception would be something that would be wonderful, but that's a hard, once those things get locked in, it's an extremely hard perception to crack.
Yeah, so, hey, Julie, good to see you. I think we need to invest in all three equally. So vaccines, antivirals, therapeutics, as well as diagnostics. So, BARDA has received some criticism because under Project NextGen, we're not investing in antivirals. Even though we have $5 billion for Project NextGen, when we looked across the landscape of what the private sector was funding, there were 2 antivirals. One was licensed and one had an EUA, and there were 3 that were in phase 3 clinical trials. We had no treatments for immunocompromised individuals or others who wouldn't respond to vaccines. So that is why we targeted monoclonal antibodies, knowing that it was going to be difficult because of the changing landscape of the variants and always trying to play catch up. But that is the reason that we didn't invest in antivirals, because of what the commercial market was doing. But moving forward, I do think we need to invest in antivirals. So NIH has their APT program, which is trying to develop broadly acting antivirals. And for an antiviral to be broadly acting, you have to show that it has efficacy for each pathogen. But I do believe that we need to be making those investments. Because if you do have an antiviral that is broadly active across either a viral family or across multiple viral families, the vaccine may not be available immediately, and you would have potentially antivirals to at least treat individuals who become infected.
So one of the things that's weird for me, Paxlovid's pretty effective. It's actually quite difficult to get it. And it seems astonishing to me for a pathogen that can have long-term sequelae, so people can have long COVID or other issues. It seems odd that it's so challenging to be able for people routinely to have access to it. And those were 2 issues that, these aren't exactly the issues of the medicine, but they had issues with both. I think remdesivir, certainly Paxlovid, had manufacturing problems where they couldn't produce as many doses, which seems surprising to me because these are small molecules, but there were significant limitations on availability. And then now there's policy access that doesn't make any sense to me. I think that it's so difficult for people when they're sick to be able to get the medicine right when they need it. And these medicines almost always work better the earliest you can take them. And so that seems like a policy adjustment that would be warranted, and it seems a little odd that hasn't been resolved.
One last quick question.
Oh, yeah, I hope this is quick. My name is Anna Marie
quick
Cox. I am a journalist, but wasn't planning on writing anything about this. But I'm curious about something you all mentioned about if you would have done differently in terms of communication piece, and would have had different industries, different communities be represented in your communicating. And I'm wondering, did other countries do better with this? And also, we seem to be talking pretty explicitly about some of the divisions here in the US that happened. Did other countries have that same kind of split and see the same kind of rise in vaccine hesitancy, and that hesitancy turn into, we've had a lot of growth in the anti-vaccine movement in general? And was that something particular to our political atmosphere? And can that be undone?
Quickly, no, it was not unique to the United States, but the sources elsewhere might have been different. So if you take a look at authoritarian societies, there was high distrust of the vaccines in both China and Russia, in no small part because trust in those regimes was not great, and also, to be blunt, their vaccines, well, the Chinese vaccine was awful. So in some cases, the distrust was well placed. Within more developed societies, there is a correlation, frankly, between sort of far-right conservative beliefs and skepticism about vaccines, period, unfortunately. It's strongest in the United States, but it is hardly unique to the United States, is the way I would put it. Whereas in developing societies, actually, part of the reason I think, in some ways, vaccine uptake might be better there is that while there are some residual, suspicions for a variety of reasons that we could get into, they're more optimistic and more trusting of their governments, which has meant that it has been easier to distribute the vaccines there.
felt that New Zealand handled the pandemic extremely well. They also had a moat, but they also had.
But they didn't have
big
the
one.
sense of urgency in terms of getting the vaccine, and this was a problem in Australia as well. Ironically, there were a lot of societies that were good at sort of warding off the disease entering. There was no sense of urgency when it came to actual vaccination.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then from the Guatemala perspective, I can't speak to every nation, but Guatemala, and historically, Mayan communities are pretty pro-vaccine because it's an expensive medicine that can protect a whole bunch of problems, and these groups are under economic duress. And so it was not until the pandemic that I ever saw anything resembling anti-vax movement in Guatemala. And then it emerged, and it came from YouTube, and it came from these sources where now there is an anti-vax movement in Mayan communities that I'd never seen before. And so I think we did have like a spread of this through these internet, like this media, and I don't know really where the source is or whether there was like an intentional government, what was the driving force? Because it seemed well financed. So, and I can't really speak to that much, but I will say that there was an emergence of an anti-vaxxer movement. It could have been some of the things you said, because they were also isolating people and they had no vaccines and everyone was frustrated. So maybe they were very receptive to this anti-vaxxer concept. But that was bizarre for me to see the appearance of this like kind of almost like an import of a new philosophy around the medicines.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think there was vaccine hesitancy for different reasons. Some of it was, anti-vaccine. Some of it was just people were tired of hearing about COVID. They were tired of having their lives interrupted. I mean, right now there's vaccine hesitancy globally. It's not an anti-vaccine movement. People are just exhausted of the pandemic. And again, this gets back to one of my earlier points, the sustainability of all this. So if there's vaccine hesitancy, manufacturers are only going to manufacture to what the commercial market will sustain. And so, even for Moderna and Pfizer, they have downscaled their manufacturing capabilities because vaccine is not, there's no desire for the vaccine globally. So, this happens for seasonal influenza, it kind of goes up and down, but typically it's anywhere between 150 to 180 million doses just in the US. And so I think we'll reach a balance at some point in the future of what that commercial sustainability is and what the manufacturing capability will be. But I think it's going to be far short of what we would need 5 years from now if there's another global pandemic.
I think part of what you just talked about, the reasonable vaccine hesitancy is that with flu and with coronavirus, people are like, I'm going to take this vaccine, and you're telling me it's 51% effective. Like, it seems, I can't promise this, but my hope is that if we make more effective broad-spectrum vaccines where they have a much higher efficacy rate, we will have some uptake. We're not going to win everybody's, but I think there's more people, certainly me, I'd be more like, even if I can get 90% protection, that sounds much better than like 30%. And so hopefully that will help that uptake process as well.
Yeah. So as we close, I'd just really like to, again, thank Advanced Technology International for sponsoring this session, and Z in particular for assembling this incredible group. Thank you to Drs. Disbrow, Dresner, and Glanville for sharing your expertise and opinions, all of which are their own and not representative of their official organizations. I'd just like to close briefly with, we've learned a lot over the last several decades, but really in the last several years. I mean, we've learned what public-private partnership looks like and how it can be successful. We've learned that communities need to engage and be part of the solution. We've learned that technology is out there to be utilized, but people have to be the ones that take it up. We've learned what it looks like when industry and government really work together on solutions instead of in silos. And to say one thing that I think we've heard a couple of times but really resonates in my own heart, I think we've learned resilience. And that is something that I hope each of us take away from today's session. So please join me in thanking our panelists.